Good evening. My name is Tazeen Hassan, and on behalf of Justice for All Canada, I welcome our distinguished panelists and audience to the third session of Justice Talks, a webinar series focused on human rights and Canadian foreign policy. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Justice for All Canada is a human rights advocacy organization working against the persecution of indigenous minorities, people, and minorities across the globe. We work with the Canadian government and lawmakers, the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Just Peace Advocates, and hundreds of other human rights and community organizations for the sake of policy changes. We also educate the masses and mobilize them to advocate human rights. Kashmir Action, Save India, Save Uyghurs are our core campaigns. But we do run solidarity campaigns for indigenous people in Canada, Palestine, and prisoners of conscience. Today's Justice Talks topic is post-2019 Kashmir. As we know, in August 2019, India revoked the autonomy of Kashmir unilaterally, unconstitutionally. Since then, thousands of laws have not only been introduced, but implemented to disenfranchise Kashmiris. Today, our panelists will discuss the settler, colonial, and genocidal policies that the Indian government has been implementing since 2019. Our webinar is taking place at a time when the news of censoring a BBC documentary against Modi is very hot. There is one good news, though, that Canadian Parliament has passed Motion 62 unanimously today morning. The motion is regarding the acceleration of Uyghur immigration in Canada. Let me remind our audience that our very first webinar of Justice Talk series covered Motion 62 in September 2022. So let me introduce the panelists. Our first panelist, Athar Zia, is an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Colorado in Anthropology. She is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupations, and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldúa Honorable Mention Award, 2021 Public Anthropologist Award, Advocate for the Year 2021, and 2021 Rosaldo Book Prize Honorable Mention. She has been featured in the Feminist 2021, a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She is the co-editor of 2020, Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? 2019, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and 2019, HarperCollins, a resolution called Peace. She has published a poetry collection, The Frame, 1999, and another collection is forthcoming. In 2013, Athar's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir won an award for the Society of Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working in the Kashmir region. Our second panelist, Dr. Mobeen, is joining us from Istanbul, a born and raised Kashmiri. He was imprisoned in August 2019 when India revoked the autonomy unilaterally. Currently, he's in self-exile in Turkey. He was elected president of the apex trade body in Kashmir, the Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industry, from 2006 to 2009. And then from 2012 to 2014, he was the president of Jammu and Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industry that included Pakistan-administered Kashmir too, i.e. when it began on both sides of the line of control. Currently, he's the senior vice chairman of the Kashmir Diaspora Collection, a coalition of some prominent Kashmiri diaspora groups working in different parts of the world, like the USA, UK, Europe, and the Middle East and Turkey. Dr. Mobeen has been an activist right from his medical school, being elected General Secretary of the Students' Union of Government Medical College, Srinagar. As I mentioned earlier, he was put in prison along with all other members of the trade unions on 5th August 2019, when they removed unilaterally the special status. His case was mentioned in the US Senate hearing, as well as Tom Lantos hearing on Tom Lantos Commission on Kashmir, resulting in his release after 4 months. He moved to Malaysia and then to Turkey, where he actually set up Kashmir House Turkey. And I've heard that it's just opposite of the Aya Sofia Mosque. He runs his own blog and his writings on social media. The government of India has put up cases under different laws to choke his voice, including sedition against the Indian state. Our other panelists will be joining, inshallah. So I am giving the introduction of Muhammad Mushtaq. Our third panelist, Professor Muhammad Mushtaq, is a legal expert on international humanitarian law, that is Geneva Convention, which deals with occupied territories. He served as Director General of the Sharia Academy and Chairman of the Department of Law at the International Islamic University, Islamabad. Presently, he is serving as Shifa Tamir-e-Millat University, Islamabad, Chairman of the Department of Sharia and Law. He obtained his degrees of LLB and LLM Sharia and Law in Islamic University and PhD in Islamic Law, Jurisprudence, and ME Political Science from the University of Peshawar. His LLM dissertation was on the legality of armed liberation struggle in Islamic and modern international, while his PhD dissertation was on the decline of Sharia in the law and its implications in Islamization. He is the author of 10 books and more research papers on the issue of Islamic law and jurisprudence, criminal law, Indian law, comparative religion. He has also served as the Supreme Court of Pakistan as amicus curiae and the Federal Shariat Court as a juris consult in several cases. So this was the introduction of our panelists. And Javeria, can you start our slideshow? I would just like to explain the context of our seminar, context of what is happening in Kashmir on the ground. So yeah, can you move the, sorry. I just want to give a disclaimer here that many activists, scholars, academics basically excused attending this webinar as a panelist amid fears of repercussions for their families. Many Kashmiris excused us. So basically, yeah, so disenfranchised. Today's justice topic is post-2019 Kashmir, which is entirely disenfranchised. Justice Talks today's session will discuss Kashmir, where the Indian state has begun a new phase of repression and settler colonialism. When Article 370 was abrogated, the BJP government claimed that the Kashmiris will get equal rights like other Indian citizens, but the reality is that the colonization drive of Indian occupied regime has accelerated. Instead of equal rights, the internet was shut down initially, and later civil society, media, and political leadership have been disenfranchised through various ways. Kashmir has been muted. People are feeling helpless. The very first action of Indian government in Kashmir was the Indian occupied regime changed the demography. Millions of domiciles have been issued to non-Kashmiris, particularly retired Indian army personnel and their families. Here, Indian state is essentially following the Israeli and Xinjiang model of settler colonialism, apartheid, and eventually genocide. Next slide. Yeah, sorry. So the second area where Indian state basically took action against the Kashmiris, disenfranchising Kashmiris, is the media. We are going to discuss Kashmir where media, journalists, human rights defenders, and politicians have been disenfranchised through detention and harassment. They are either detained on terrorism charges or to the extent that they delete their own online presence. They are deleting their articles. Online media is deleting all the articles regarding the Kashmir. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Sana Mattu was barred from leaving India. Kashmiri Press Club has been sealed. Kashmiri students were jailed and threatened in 2021, threatened to be skinned alive because they supported Pakistani cricket team. It has become impossible to report what is happening in Kashmir. Human rights defenders like Khurram Parvez are barred from documenting human rights violations on terror charges. Next slide. So yeah, digital surveillance. In 2021, India has purchased Pegasus from Israel. Ordinary people are detained on charges of using social media to express their opinions. And according to the news, India has purchased Pegasus from Israel for digital surveillance. United Nations officials, foreign emissaries, even US ambassadors are not allowed to visit Kashmir. Next slide. In 2022, India announced a unique family ID introduction for Kashmiris. This is not happening anywhere in, so this is essentially apartheid. And let me remind that Chinese state has been doing this in Xinjiang since decades. So this policy is also emulating other genocidal policies. Next. Then political leadership has always faced the repression, but now after 2019, entire political leadership of Kashmir has been detained. Many of them have died. Ashraf Sehrai, the political leader belonging to Hurriyat Conference, died at the age of 77. And then last year in 2022, Altaf Shah, son-in-law of Sayyid Ali Gilani, died of cancer. He was treated with the paracetamols or Panadol pills until the Kashmiri prisoners protested, and he was moved to the hospital where he was diagnosed with cancer, and then he died a week later in prison. And his family was not allowed to meet him, even in the hospital. Just his daughter was allowed at the last minute when he was in coma. So Kashmiri political leadership, Shabbir Shah is in jail since 37 years, non-consecutively. Then there are Ashraf Sehrai and Yasin Malik. Yasin Malik went on hunger strike. Amnesty International and many other organizations requested Indian government to move them on house arrest during the pandemic, but Indian regime did not do that. Next slide. Then there is one more. Then there are anti-terror laws which were always there. I mean, Public Security Act, which is called lawless law by Amnesty International, and then UAPA, that is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, that is applied to any peaceful dissent in Kashmir. Next slide. Then house demolitions. Recently, Kashmir, where the Indian occupied regime is demolishing the houses of Kashmiris on a massive scale. Again, the Indian government is following an Israeli model here. Since the illegal revocation of autonomy, the Indian state has changed about 1,000 laws disenfranchising Kashmir from their own land and business. And demolishing the houses are on the basis of encroachment. Although I believe that our panelists will explain what is encroachment and illegal occupation. Next slide. Then Kashmiri's economic backbone is being broken. I mean, this year, this is just an example that I was told from authentic sources within Kashmir, that this year entire apple crop was destroyed by Indian Army blocked the Jammu-Srinagar road on the excuse that construction is going on here. And the entire apple crop was destroyed there. So, and then about majority of the Kashmiri commercial projects has been awarded to non-Kashmiri investors. With the abrogation of Article 370, India also revoked 35A. That actually prevented that in the past, 35A has prevented non-Kashmiris buying land in Kashmir. So this happened, and then there are many, in some areas, there are 100% of the projects, commercial projects, has been awarded to non-Kashmiri investors. So this is the situation. I will invite. Now then, in the end, in 2022, India announced that G20 2023, for which India has been declared a host, will be held in Kashmir. G20 is held in Delhi, we know that, but some of the meetings India is trying to held in Kashmir, so we are on that too. So now I will invite the next slide. I think it's over. Yeah, eviction of then many nomadic tribes and forest dwellers have been evicted on the same accusation of encroachment. I believe that our panel will talk about it in detail. So now I will invite Dr. Athar Zia for her opening remarks. Dr. Athar Zia.
Thank you. I'm here. So, Assalamu alaikum. Hello to everyone. And thank you for inviting me to deliver a talk on, I know that the topic is post-2019. So in the interest that I'm going ahead, I do want to give a little context to the sort of the historicity of what 2019 means, and then also speak to some of the things that you raised in the slides. And hopefully that will set the tone for Dr. Shah. So can you tell me how much time I have to speak?
You can speak for 5 to 6 minutes, Dr. Athar.
Okay. So one of the things that I do want to reiterate before we start is that when we think about post-2019, it gives us the impression that whatever happened before 2019 was somewhat easier on Kashmiris, or was not this intense, or was not this aggravated and exacerbated. So the most important thing to know is that in 2019, what happened was that India took away what was left of the autonomy. And that autonomy, which under Article 370, like it came in two ways. One was Article 370 that was negotiated between the client politicians in Kashmir and Indians, and also 35A, which gave them territorial sovereignty. But very little had remained of the Article 370. India had taken over slowly and steadily. From 1948 itself, it had eroded autonomy. In the 1960s, you saw that symbolically and also effectively in the changing of the nomenclature. Till then, you had a prime minister and president, just like in Azad Kashmir, in the Indian occupied Kashmir. But after the phase of 1960s, India demoted that nomenclature and that office to that of the governor and the chief minister, just like it had in other states. So what we have seen from 1948 onwards, after the Article 370, which was called the Special Status Article or the Autonomy Article, it was kind of like eroded right from the very first instance. It was eroded slowly and steadily. So what remained till 2019 was effectively the 35A, which was the territorial sovereignty agreement, which meant that Indians could not freely come inside Kashmir and buy land. They didn't have right to franchise. They didn't have the right to property. But that did not mean that Indians were not inside Kashmir doing businesses. That did not mean that they hadn't taken leases for over like 75 years, doing all kinds of business inside Kashmir. So they had the wherewithal. And many, many laws had already been changed. So we have to remember that when we are talking about what happens in Kashmir post-2019, doesn't make BJP any different from what Congress was, which was seen as the secular party. So Kashmiris have experienced India in its settler colonial mode right from 1947, and even before, when India was kind of coalescing into a country. So that's something important for international audiences or people who are getting introduced to the history of Kashmir. That's very important for them to know that post-2019, things have exacerbated in a way that it's settler colonialism on steroids. Otherwise, till 2019, it still was settler colonialism. One of the members of Congress, which is considered to be the secular party in India, which is again, majority of that party is also dominated by upper caste Hindu men. So that party that actually boasted in 2019 that we have changed the Article 12 times. The special status of Kashmir has been changed 12 times, but discreetly. And we did not create the militaristic spectacle that BJP created. That's the only difference. But it is the truth that right now, the way settler colonialism is operating in Kashmir is much more brazen. It's much more, quote unquote, spectacular. And India is trying to get this message across without any apology, without any discreetness, without trying to appease to the international audiences. And that also speaks to the geopolitics of the moment. So for us, people who are studying Kashmir critically, who are Kashmiris, for us, there is no post-2019 or pre-2019. It's only the degree of repression that has changed, and not even the degree. It is the intensity of the degree that has changed. And when you were talking about that it will become eventually a genocide, whereas in our work, the critical Kashmir scholars have already shown that it's an incremental genocide. It already is a genocide. It doesn't need to become quote unquote, a very stereotypical form because it's happening every day. As we speak today, everything and anything that comprises a genocide has happened inside Kashmir. It has 100,000 people, both combatants and non-combatants, who've been killed from 1989 onwards. And even before that, killings were happening, disappearances were happening, but in a different form. So that's something that we have to consider, that it doesn't, like, what makes a genocide? So do we have to follow a stereotypical way of looking at genocide, like definition that the UN gives us, which itself is a sort of a settler colonial institution? Or do we really take into cognizance the killing of people, not just civilians, which people, many times people are like, oh, these were civilians, these are combatants. And should combatants be killed? Isn't there any Geneva Convention that should be applied to Kashmir because it is a disputed territory? Every day or every week, you have at least young juvenile Kashmiris who are being killed under the category of being combatants. And no one really asks any question. It's kind of like taken en masse that these are people who are rising against the state, but no one dares ask this question in the international community, except for some people who sympathize with Kashmir and the Kashmiri activists, asking about the lives of these people who are being ruthlessly killed in their hideouts. And one of the things that the Indian Army does is that it doesn't give these people a chance to fight back. Usually if they're in a hideout, in a house, let's say, they will bomb the entire house. They will have some kind of a demolition, and they have these chemicals, propellants, with which they are going to burn the entire property and burn those combatants inside. That was one of the major tactics that Indian Army went on record to say that this is the easiest way to fight this war, with scant regard to the lives that were being consumed in that, just because they're combatants, and very easily tell the international community that these are terrorists. Not that, so what that means is that we also have to engage with Kashmir's history. We don't have to see Kashmir from the lens of India or Pakistan's history. We also have to see Kashmir as its own history, through the lens of its own people. How do they see their struggle from 1947 onwards, which they see as a just resistance given to the sovereignty of India. So that's another thing that I wanted to say, and also speak to the media. You know, it's become very difficult for Kashmiri journalists to cover Kashmir. And the only news that's allowed from Kashmir right now is when something shows India in positive light. That's the only news that's coming out right now. So Kashmiri media has really worked very hard in the last 30 years and even before that to present, you know, whatever they could within the rubric of the media houses, which again were dominated by the Indian companies, whatever they could present to the rest of the world and in the international media. But at the same time, that doesn't mean censorship has not existed. What has happened after 2019, it's been exacerbated to the level of institutionalization. Now you actually have a media law in place. So again, we have to consider we cannot say that there is the post-2019 and pre, because that gives us a sense that something was easy and something was okay before, which it was not. So censorship was always there, but it wasn't this regulated and this institutionalized. And now it's basically a law there. And then also thinking about, I think you'd earlier asked me to speak to the environment part of it. We do have to kind of understand that this is a place which has roughly like 8 million people, and I'm kind of like considering both sides of the LOC, the line of actual control or line of control. So we do know that there are more than 700,000 military troops inside Kashmir at the moment, and not just at the frontiers, but also in the cities and villages. And that in itself is a big environmental disaster. I mean, I'm just speaking to you. You had specifically asked me to speak to the environmental side, and everything is contributing to it in the moment. Like when these G20 meetings happen, it doesn't only mean, let's take that example. I mean, it doesn't just mean that these people are going in. This is also like a heavy load of people and carbon imprint that is also being taxing the environment. And that adds to the ecocidal stress that is happening inside Kashmir because of how much troops are there, and how the local economy is being changed, and how much tourism, which is like mindless tourism, not just the regular tourism, the leisure and pleasure activities, but also religious pilgrimages that are being encouraged, which is also known as religious pilgrimage terrorism that is happening on the environment inside Kashmir. And I think in the Q&A, we can actually talk about some examples, like you earlier asked me to kind of speak to maybe the Amarnath Yatra and all of that. I don't think I have that kind of time in this talk right now, but of course in Q&A, we can talk about that. So we have to take that into consideration as well. Like there is all kinds of, there is economic genocide. One is the genocide of life. There is the economic genocide, and you also have environmental genocide happening. And all that is happening under the garb of development. That's what India is telling rest of the world. And it's very easy in an Islamophobic world to put two and two together, like thinking about Muslims and thinking about resistance and thinking about armed resistance specifically. It's very easy for the rest of the world to buy India's argument. And especially because India is a big country and it does a lot of business with the rest of the world, especially the US, especially in arms and armaments and weaponry, which goes back to Kashmir. That's the kind of repression that's happening inside Kashmir. It's all kinds, So when you have that kind of a situation where India is doing big business, no one is really paying attention to the kind of violence it's wreaking on Kashmiri Muslims, and how it can be clearly seen when we think about the Islamophobic lens or anti-Islam lens, so to speak. So those are the few points that I wanted to speak to. I'll hand it over to Dr. Shah, and then we can take some Q&A, question and answers. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will invite Dr. Shah now for his opening remarks.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a very important talk, but let me first clarify that I don't know what you mean by disenfranchisement. Is it after post-2019? And do you feel it is within what you're talking about is within the Indian Constitution, which we do not, agree, we do not recognize? The disenfranchisement in case of Kashmir is basically we are not given that right of self-determination. That is the main thing. And, till that is not given, all the impacts which are happening in Kashmir, right from 1947 is because of that. And it is rightly pointed out by Athar that this is not a post-2019 thing. It has been right from 1947. Both the Congress as well as the BJP are two sides of the same coin. One did it subtly and the other did it aggressively. And now, basically, when you talk about not giving the right of self-determination to Kashmiris, what has been the impact? The impact has been, to me, what I feel is that our 4.5 million people have been directly affected by this. And how do I calculate this? I calculate this because of the fact that, about 100,000 people have been martyred, about 150,000 people have been arrested. There will be even more, and 8,500 custodial killings, 12,000 disappearances, 110,000 structures destroyed, arson, 11,170 rape cases, and with injured running in hundreds of thousands, and with at least 7,000 with pallet injuries, and out of which 700 of them are with blindness of different levels. Now, if you calculate this and total it all up, it comes to about 450,000 people. And if these 450,000 people in our society, like, in South Asia particularly, the families are very closely knit, and you will have a minimum of 10 people affected by it, your parents, your brothers, sisters, uncles, and all that. And this comes to about 450,000 people, 4.5 million people. And that is roughly about almost every alternate family, alternate house is affected. And now what has happened to this? What has been added problem with this? Is that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is now more prevalent. And because of that, and which I've been telling all along, is this thing that, being a doctor by education, basically, and, that the escape route for our youth because of all this is drugs. Now, drugs are becoming prevalent. And now this is what is the impact of all this, of not giving us the right of self-determination, which is our right, birthright. And it's also, also by United Nations resolutions. Now, as I talked about genocide, according to me, I am a layman in this manner, but when I study it, and I have sort of taken it like that amounts to genocide. Why? Because of killing of Kashmiris, about more than 100,000. Second, causing serious bodily injuries, about 7,000 pellet injuries besides other injuries, or mental harm, that is PTSD. As clearly India is doing under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which defines what amounts to genocide. We are already, they have done genocide. India has done genocide. It's not a question of genocide watch that they put India on notice. No, India has done genocide in Kashmir. Now, coming to the settler colonialism thing, this has to be understood that first they ensured military impunity. That means no laws were applicable to any military army man under AFSPA. They can do anything they want. Arbitrary detention, and then displacement of people. Displacement to the removal of 35A. This is what happened after 2019. India can now use the territory of Kashmir for investment, natural resources, and a new community of residents. Now, some of our Kashmiri scholars have said, in the words of Kashmiri scholar, I can quote, 5th August was not a beginning, not a diversion, not a rupture, but the extension of 70 years of mass killings, blinding, torturing, disappearances, and rape, all of which advance the mission to physically and symbolically eliminate the Kashmiris. This is what it is. And people of the world and have to understand this is what see, we have to differentiate. I slightly differ in this extent that, India was before this a colonizer. It was not a settler colonizer. Before the 5th August was that, well, colonizers say, work for me, and while a settler colonizer, permanent occupiers with goal is to exploit the resources. So they were not only exploiting our resources before this, that was, for example, power like water for power generation. And while as now they have come to occupy us. This is in Kashmir, settler, colonial, and military machinery have intertwined with each other. With great and familiar intimacy, the latter has ultimately enabled the goal of the former to erase. So this is their, the motive behind all this. And this is what is very important. People have to understand that the whole system is now there. They have now started taking away of land in different pretexts by making all these. In October 22, they have made laws which are completely, for example, they have made laws that agriculture, previously we had a law that agricultural land cannot be used for anything else. Now it is very easy to change the agricultural land and give it to industries and everything. So this is all basically a system by which they want to occupy and settle people from outside. And by now the train coming in to Kashmir, this is another problem which is going to people. India can move machinery, India can move army at such a pace into Kashmir that, there will be, unfortunately, after some time, no Kashmiri left. They will subjugate them. They are already they cannot speak, and India has a lot of population, and a lot of poor people. They just can shift thousands and lakhs of people and hundreds of thousands of people in days by the train coming in and to Kashmir through. Now they have spent a lot of money on that infrastructure. It's not for development of Kashmir, certainly. It is for occupying Kashmir. These are my basic initial remarks about the whole situation in Kashmir. And this is what I feel. There is need of certain actions to be done. We could discuss that further on. And this is what my initial reactions is about the subject today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mubin and Dr. Athar. Dr. Mubin was talking about extrajudicial killings, rapes, disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and the use of AFSPA and PSA and UAPA. Now we will come to the question and answer session. So basically, Dr. Athar, I would like you to talk about the gender-based violence in Kashmir. As we have seen the rapes used as a war weapon in Kashmir. So we would like you to illustrate on that, expand on this issue.
Yeah, talking about gender-based violence, I think, one of the answers to gender-based violence, everyone wants to kind of focus on women. But I think we also have to consider it's a very just stereotypical way of looking at any situation, any kind of conflict. And it becomes very easy to see it from the perspective of how Eurocentric academy and Eurocentric knowledges teach us to look at a certain conflict. When we think about gender-based violence, I think primarily what is happening in Kashmir, men are being killed indiscriminately, even till today. And then women suffer in their own ways, which is, of course, we talk about rape being a weapon of war. We talk about the grave human rights abuses, such as the enforced disappearances, because of which the women begin suffering because their husband or their son has been forcibly disappeared in custody. And that's one of the preeminent examples of human rights violations and how women suffer and how their families and their communities implode because of a certain human rights abuse that has been caused in case of enforced disappearances, where the men actually are either taken into custody or they just leave in the morning, never return in the evening. So when we think about gender-based violence, it's not that women suffer and then men don't. They're both suffering in their own ways, in gender essential ways. When we talk about rape being a weapon of war, it doesn't mean only women are subjected to rapes. It's also men. Men don't talk about rape in the same manner as we talk about rapes of women. Men also suffer sexual violence of different kinds. And that's what we have seen in Kashmir. There are statistics that 2 in 7 Kashmiris have either been subject of some kind of physical torture, including sexual torture, and it's both men and women and others as well, other genders as well. So I think, when we talk about gender-based violence, one of the ways we look at gender-based violence is just as violence on women. But I think we need to take a very holistic view of what's happening in Kashmir or other places as well, that it is affecting all genders in its gender essential way. And then there are also, different kinds of issues that women face when they are under this severely ethno-religious, military, patriarchal, industrial complex that is India and its occupation and its troops inside Kashmir. So in that, Kashmiri men are essentially, for lack of a better word, they are feminized because they are so much discriminated in a securitized manner. I mean, there are examples, and they still continue. In the 90s, men, if they had to leave house, let's say for an errand, they were usually accompanied by women. And because it was seen as something like, the women would act as a chaperone. It would be a mother, a sister, or a younger female trying to give security to that man, because it was easier to leave house for men to do a certain errand with the women present with them, because it gave an idea that they probably were a family and not combatants. But that was no guarantee. It wasn't a guarantee either. If the woman was with, there have been many instances when both of them were killed at the checkpoint, where both of them were harassed and humiliated, and they often are at checkpoints, because there are many checkpoints and many bunkers. The entire Kashmir and the capital of Kashmir is woven with bunkers and all kinds of military outposts. So that wasn't a guarantee that when a woman was chaperoning a man, that it would become easier. So, there's so many ramifications to what a military occupation can do to people. And in that, we also have to kind of consider that Kashmiri men are also bearing the brunt of what the Indian occupation, and as much as women. But then women are also facing the double bind. One is that they are facing the military-industrial complex in a way women do, which is they are less likely to be killed instantly than to be sexually exploited and molested or harassed, or even sexual violence caused to their bodies. But at the same time, they're also facing the situation pretty much on the level of community as well, because when men get killed, when men are in prisons, when men are disappeared, the women are left to bear the brunt of carrying on the community. And that is what we see in Kashmir. So in all forms of violence that can be done, all forms of violence, not only on bodies, but also on communities that can be done, has been done by the Indian occupation on Kashmiris. And in that, men and women, they suffer in enmeshed ways. They're together in this. And I would really want to look at the suffering holistically, rather than just think about sort of rape being as an issue with women. It is an issue with women, and it is exacerbated, but it also kind of hides how much sexual violence is happening overall on Kashmiris. And thank you.
Sister Athar, this is a new way of looking at the gender violence. I'm really grateful that you pointed out that men are more victimized in this situation. Dr. Mubin,
I wouldn't really put it in more or less. I would say in their own ways, and we tend to many times we kind of like don't see it.
Yeah, as you said that they are feminine. They are also victimized, gender-based violence. So this is a new way of looking at gender-based violence, essentially. So Dr. Mubin, my next question with you is about the economic policies. I know that depression was there before 2019 too, and depression is there, but definitely things have changed. So would you like to explain the economic policies that are affecting Kashmiris right now? I mean, destroying the apple crop, this has not happened. I mean, this doesn't happen. We don't see it happening before 2019. Then there are awarding business contracts to the non-Kashmiri investors. Then non-Kashmiri investors can buy land in Kashmir. Then we see sand and mining projects, mineral sending projects to non-Kashmiris. 100% of the contracts went in Srinagar. 100% of the contract went to non-Kashmiris. So will you please expand to these Indian policies which will break Kashmiris economically? Thank you.
Thank you for asking this question because of economy, because being past president of the chamber and very much connected with the economy of Kashmir. Let me this is what we have seen, because I have written in my blog also about this, that what is the basically what has been the model of this economic by India in Kashmir. There are basically going to be about three important things in this. You have to understand this, that India had in place, right from beginning, 1947, after, when Bakshi took over from Sheikh Abdullah, they had a system of pushback. The system of pushback, that is how they occupied the businesses there. The ruler at that point of time whoever dissented against it, his business was taken over. They became partners, and anybody who did not agree was pushed back to Pakistan. There are not so many thousands of instances like that, and which was never reported and never brought into. That is how the Bakshi family took over almost all the prime businesses in Kashmir, and they were called at a period of time BBC, that the Bakshi Brothers Corporation. So this is one part. This is the one way they controlled this thing. And now, after that, what happened is what economic losses. For example, after 1990, when I was the president, we calculated that how many days we have lost because of strikes, curfews, and all that. 3,000. And people now understand, because of this COVID thing, that when you're completely locked down. And Kashmiris have lost 3,000 days. That's almost 10 years in 30 years. So you can understand what is the economic losses the Kashmiri businessmen have gone through. Number 3, economic occupation. This is a very important thing which we have to understand. For example, they have occupied one of our main resources, that is water. That is, they generate power. And that power generated is taken away to other parts of India, while as people within Kashmir face blackouts. And you have to understand that, the NHPC, that the corporation they have created, has an asset base of $97 billion with a yearly income of $110 million. And 1/3 of its generating capacity is in Kashmir, and has rightly got the name of East India Company in Kashmir. So this is another aspect of this which has to be understood, that now, yes, for example, the fruit industry. Now, let us take the fruit industry into question. Presently, what has happened is that they made it by one way or other, the delay of the fruit into the market, resulting in loss, because all the fruit became, bad. It could not sustain, because we don't have yet the capacity to have cold storages in Kashmir. We have, but it is only a very small percentage of the total production of apple. So this is one sector which which sustained us during those times of 1990s, when completely was closed, because this did not need opening of businesses, and fruit was an industry which sustained us during that time. And that is why they have gone after it in a subtle way, in a way which people may not realize, but this is happening. And now, you see, they have done another thing, presently in the business things, that a lot of local assets have been created on leased properties, particularly resort places like Gulmarg and Pahalgam, whose leases are not being renewed, as by change of laws we fear they'll be handed over to big corporations. They are saying that, we will auction it. Auction it, give it only to local people. Why? But they want big corporations of India to cover up. And that is what is going to happen. This will, the resorts like Gulmarg and Pahalgam will be taken over by these big corporates of India. They will pay very, very high prices. On one side, they will say that this is what is the value of this place. But at the same time, we will get occupied economically by the Indian corporates, and local people will be workers, not owners. And now also they have, what has happened, unfortunately, that the previous government of Mufti Said took over our Waqf properties. They made it under the government, which was previously under a trust. Which was unfortunately mismanaged by the Sheikh family. It will become a Sheikh fiefdom. And now, under that pretext, all the Waqf properties, which is a very big Muslim Waqf, which was owned by the people of Kashmir, is now a government property. And they are going to now we have to understand those properties are all now government properties and they can do anything with it. And they have now even taken out decrees that all the masjids and all those shrines which are under the waqf, they cannot speak anything. They have to take necessary permissions for whatever to speak in khutbahs and all that. This is what is occupation. This is complete occupation in everything, whether economically, whether our lands and everything is all occupation. Nothing else is left. This is what my feeling about it.
Thank you. You were talking about the economic policies that are damaging economic backbone. So thank you very much, Dr. Mubin. And now Dr. Athar. Dr. Athar Zia.
Yes.
I would like to ask you about silencing the media, silencing Kashmiris. India has been doing that. I mean, in the documentary, they quoted Modi saying that I regret that I could not handle the media well. But here in Kashmir, we see that they have been handling the media very efficiently. So would you like to explain these things? I mean, how they have controlled the media, how they have controlled the human rights defenders who were documenting the human rights violations, and how they are not providing visas to the foreign emissaries and the US USERV department. We would like you to talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can see that as part of the new policy that they have been putting in place after 2019. But all of that has been happening before. It's not as if the journalists where, one of the journalists, Asif Sultan, he was not, he's kind of like the symbolic case of a journalist who has been incarcerated for a long time. So he wasn't incarcerated after 2019. He was incarcerated somewhere in 2017, which is right after, 2016, when there was a big uprising in Kashmir during the summer, when a young 21-year-old commander named Burhan Wani, he was killed by the Indian Army. And at that time, you had the quote unquote, the Kashmiri administration, which of course was in cahoots with the BJP. But at the same time, we also have to understand that Kashmir has been under the rule of client politicians since 1947. So it's not as if Kashmiris have been, it was a disputed area. It was a disputed land for all practical purposes, with whatever misgivings the UN has as an institution, as a post-colonial / a long arm of neo-colonialism as well. Kashmir has been on the agenda along with Palestine from 1948 itself. So the very basis of the administrations and governances in Kashmir is illicit. And so and we have to consider and we have to understand those governments, like what were they doing, who was voting for them, what was actually happening. So they also have been incarcerating people and journalists, maybe not at the same rate and en masse like the BJP is doing, but BJP is actually working on the foundations laid by those governments, which were illicit governments because they were based on ill-founded elections in 1951. Because you do not hold elections in a disputed territory. And if we go to 1951, the United Nations asks the Indian government, like, how is it able to hold elections in a disputed territory, which is sub judice? And India at that time says that we are doing the elections for governance because we have to govern the area. But referendum is still part of, or plebiscite is still part of our promise to the people. And that's how the basis of illicit elections was formed. And the moment that happened in 1951 and in 1948 or 49, the autonomy agreement was already in place between client politicians and the Indian government. So Kashmiri people literally had not been asked the way you do in a certain democratic fashion. So they have never been asked about these governments. But what they have been engineered into doing is kind of like voting for those governances or the structures that were given to them in which they had someone who was governing them from their own population. But those people were client politicians. They were carrying India's water. They were doing India's bidding. So they haven't been easy on Kashmiri journalists. When we think about enforced disappearances, we think about enforced disappearances that have happened after 1989. But there are enforced disappearances, and there are journalists who have actually worked on that had happened from 1947 till 1989. It's just that they were not called enforced disappearances because they had happened in such a discreet manner, in such a sinister manner, that these people were taken out of circulation, killed, and there are some documented cases. And the other thing is, which Dr. Shah said, that he doesn't agree that it's been settler colonialism right from the get-go. But I don't think I personally want to get into the semantics of when does it become settler colonialism and when is it classic colonialism. I think any kind of colonialism / neo-colonialism is a foundation of settler colonialism. We talk about migration of Pandits, we talk about migration of Kashmiri Muslims who are pro-India. We talk about, all sorts of, no one really talks about how many people have been exiled from 1947 till 1989 who had to cross the line of the ceasefire line and move to Azad Kashmir. So no one really talks about those exoduses. No one talks about those Kashmiris who have been exiled and who had to run away to the rest of the globe, in England, in Europe, in US, and who can't go back home. So that has happened, and the other thing is, like, settler colonialism doesn't come in the form of, like, I'm going to transfer my people right now. But policies have been in place. Nehru, which is the first Prime Minister of India, he actually said, it's on record in history books, when he said that this Article 370, which makes Kashmir special, it actually is going to be eroded at one point in time, and Kashmir will be fully integrated. So there was already a plan for what is happening now. So what BJP is doing, it's reaping the fruits of what has been planted in 1947 in itself. So when we see journalists today being censored, which is your original question, which we see journalists being incarcerated, where we see human rights defenders being openly incarcerated, that doesn't mean that they were doing their work in very free fashion before 2019. One of the co-founders of Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons and Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, Parvez Imroz, he was many times he was shot at. And same has happened to many other people who have been civil society activists or who have been part of the resistance or what was called the pro-freedom camp. I don't really see the use of pro there, but they are these freedom fighters. So this has been ongoing. And the client politicians who have been ruling Kashmir for India, the collaborators from 1947, and they actually had laws that they had made. You mentioned Mehbooba Mufti earlier. What was she doing in 2016, 2017 in cahoots with the Indian government, in cahoots with BJP? She was doing the exact same thing, what the Indian government is doing today. The only thing is that she was doing with the 35A intact, where the territorial sovereignty of Kashmir was still intact. But that did not mean that Kashmir was ruled openly and freely under some democratic conditions. It was the politics and weaponization of democratic tools that India was doing, showing the rest of the world that people are voting. Kashmiris actually see voting as two forms. One, they see as voting as governance for shelter, food, and water. And the other is the politics of azadi or politics of freedom. They see them as very different. So that needs to be considered. And one thing that I want to say about the client politicians, they were not seen as client politicians because India was trying very hard to tell the rest of the world that Kashmiris are taking part in voting. They're taking part in elections. But that is not, it's not a licit, it's not a legal way of governing people whose territory is disputed. And I think that's the history that is being sort of excavated by civil society activists, by people in diaspora, by scholars and human rights defenders. That's what Kashmiris have been doing actively for the last 30 years, trying to tell the world that the narrative that you're buying from India is not right, that Kashmiris are a people who have had a stance in this whole political dispute. It's not just a territorial dispute or an internal dispute. It's actually a dispute where people want the right to self-determination. And one of the reasons, one of the conclusions of that right to self-determination for a lot of people is independence, and some want to accede to Pakistan. And then there are collaborators of India as well.
Thank you very much, Sister Dr. Atharzia. Basically, now we are at the end. So I would like, I would like to ask one more question about G20. What may be the repercussions of holding G20 meetings in Kashmir? Kindly be short in response that we have to close. We have to wind up the webinar. Sister, first, and then Dr. Atharzia, the same question.
G20, basically the Indian government wants to sort of regularize what they have done in Kashmir, to tell the world that this is an integral part of India. And unfortunately, the G20 countries, in which a number of them are from OIC people, and they have to take steps that they have to not come to Kashmir to justify this thing. And it's very important for us in a way that this action should not give them an opportunity, the India, to boast about it, that, this is a recognition by these countries that now the same thing is going to happen, because I saw just today that in the next World Cup, which is being cricket, they're going to have a match in Kashmir. So I don't know whether, what will happen to that. This is all, sort of what you call to make a narrative, Indian narrative that, Kashmir is a part of India, which it is not. And this is the basic idea behind it, nothing else.
So just to add to what Dr. Shah has said, how do you think that it's a normal place where you have like 700, you have more than 700,000 troops, and the place is actually recognized as one of the most beautiful open air prisons? How do you hold such an economic forum there? I think it's an answer that we really don't need to. I mean, for people who don't know the history of Kashmir, but for people who see Kashmir, who watch Kashmir, this is ironic, and it's a joke that is being played on the rest of the world. And of course, it's tragic for Kashmiris. So how do you even have these myths of having these big meetings and economic forum inside Kashmir when the local population is technically under house arrest, when they cannot speak, when they're silent? Their journalists can't speak. People are killed every day. When they cannot walk the streets properly, when their women are not safe, when their children are not safe, when their elders are not safe, when their properties are not safe. So the evictions.
The laws.
How do you do a G20 in such a place and then tell the rest of the world? The rest of the world is, it's kind of like buying India's narrative for n number of reasons. But I think it's going to be really tragic to kind of like watch this and then see how it's unfolding for Kashmiris. And it's really, I think it's tragic to watch this incremental genocide that's happening inside Kashmir and no one really speaking about it in those terms.
Dr. Athar, I have one more question for you. Am I muted?
No, I'm able to hear you, yeah.
Yeah, basically, Dr. Athar, what is the impact of all these, what is happening in Kashmir on the diaspora? I mean, what is the psychologically, they are also victims, I know. Many of the people in the diaspora, they, as I mentioned earlier, that they refused to join us as panelists amid fears of repercussions from the Indian government. And then there is one more aspect of this psychological aspect. I mean, how you people are suffering psychologically. So I would like you to expand on this.
I don't know if I got the import of the whole question. Do you want me to speak about like what's the situation in diaspora? I think after 2019, a lot of people in the diaspora have been trying to educate the rest of the world because of the urgency. the way settler colonialism is now openly and brazenly on steroids, and people are seeing that it's not just people who have been part of the resistance movement, it's not just the journalists, but it's the entire communities. It's people who, there's a scholar who had written an article in 2010, and he was doing his PhD, and he's in jail today because of that one article that he's written. And of course, you know, all Kashmiris are culpable of thinking about their freedom and thinking about resistance. But those are the examples that are being made today that no one can speak. And thinking about diaspora, I feel like diaspora has realized its position and also some of the privilege that the distance is giving it about speaking about Kashmir or creating awareness. But then there's also, they also have stakes because they have family back home. And that kind of creates a lot of danger because Indian government is pulling out all stops in trying to create repression wherever it can. And it also has policies in place. For example, a law that you were talking about earlier, the UAPA law, and it wants to kind of extend its ambit to people who are on foreign shores and basically speaking against India, and they want to kind of like bring them into the sort of the long arm of UAPA. So at this present moment, I would say that the diaspora is paying close attention to what's happening in Kashmir. There are leaders, there are opinion leaders, there are freedom fighters who are part of that. There are scholars who are part of that. And I think it's a very generative movement. There are different ways and layers in diaspora where conversations are happening. And then there are also, quote unquote, the old guards who have been working for Kashmir for the last 40, 50 years, and in whatever capacity, trying to educate and create awareness. And I think there is a conversation happening, but I mean, it's just, for me, it's very generative at the present moment. And I'm just glad that we're talking about it. And then there are opinion leaders like Dr. Shah himself, and people like him and his contemporaries and my contemporaries who are in diaspora and trying to speak for Kashmir. And of course, not without risks. And those risks will always stay. And then we just take one risk at a time and as it comes. So it's kind of unfolding at the moment. But one thing that I'm very positive about is sort of like the international solidarity that is building around Kashmir. Because Kashmir is not in isolation. You know, we think about Kashmir as maybe an isolated case in South Asia between India and Pakistan. No, it's nothing like that. It's all related, because even in the US, you have the indigenous people's movement that are working against settler colonialism of the US imperialism. And there are similar cases in other places. So I see there's a conversation happening, and we are getting more and more enlightened about how to create solidarities and how to talk about these issues. And I'm hopeful that it is going to be generative and it is going to be a learning experience for the Kashmiri diaspora as well.
Thank you, Dr. Athar. You are right that conversation is happening in media, conversation is happening around the organizations like Journalists Without Borders, conversation is happening against the settler colonialism. Even in Canadian media, we see journalists and reporters are writing about Kashmir, Reuters and Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, but we do not see any change in the rhetoric of the politicians, if you see. There is a big baggage. I mean, the liberals, the conservatives here in conservatives, Alhamdulillah, NDP has worked with us. So yeah, we would like to end here. MashaAllah, it was a great, I mean, Dr.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one thing before you close. You have to understand that India is on a major propaganda offensive to convince the world that its brutal occupation and repression in Kashmir are part of the epic battle against Muslim terrorism, an epic battle that is completely manufactured to justify war, occupation, and genocide. This is the crux of the whole thing, what India is trying to do. By doing these, the journalists and everybody who speaks up against Kashmir, they are now doing what? You know, the Indian police has said that beware social media users aiding and abetting of terror is as grave as actual act of terror. And they are declaring them as terrorists. We have a friend here who's a doctor who was only doing on social media and everything, and he has been declared by their laws under UAPA as a terrorist. This is the whole thing, you know, the crux of the whole issue, that what they are trying to do and what they are trying to manufacture narratives for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Praveen, and thank you, Dr. Athar. It was a great conversation, and we have discussed the policies, the unique digital ID, the environmental damage to Kashmir because of the Indian state policies. We discussed a pre-2019 scenario as well as the post-2019 scenario. And hopefully we will be struggling along with our coalition partners in America, in Europe, elsewhere. We will be struggling, inshallah. So Justice for All has been doing, this is our free action, Kashmir action campaign is dealing with all these. And we invite all our audience to join us through our subscription list, donate for us, volunteer with us. We welcome you to be a part of this struggle against the settler colonialism, against genocide, against apartheid. Thank you very much, everyone. I will again thank the distinguished panelists, Dr. Athar and Dr. Mobeen, for joining us today. And inshallah, we will be doing the same Justice Talks webinar. This is a monthly webinar focused on our core campaigns, core and solidarity campaigns. Inshallah, we will be doing that every month. Don't forget to join us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Visit our website, justiceforallcanada.org. Thank you.